"Please," the widow whispered, gripping the stranger's arm as riders gathered outside. "Pretend you're my husband." Elias Thorne had lied to lawmen, soldiers, and killers. But no lie had ever asked this much of him. Hours earlier, he had ridden into burnt corn, looking only for water and a place to disappear. In the summer of 1814, the sun over the Mississippi Territory was a cruel, unblinking master. It hammered the red clay and punished everything beneath it. Elias Thorne pulled the brim of his hat lower, shielding eyes that had seen too much blood and not enough mercy. His hat was salt-stained, frayed, and gray with road dust. He was an outlaw by trade, moving through a territory still bleeding from the Creek War. His lean bay mare stumbled beneath him, her ribs visible through a coat darkened with sweat. Ahead, burnt corn shimmered in the heat haze, a scattering of gray timber, rusted iron, and blackened ruins. A year earlier, militia forces had attacked a party of Red Stick Creeks near Burnt Corn Creek, helping turn a season of tension into open war. Since then, raids, fear, and flight had emptied farms across the region. He wanted water, shade, and a dark corner in which to hide the head carrying a $200 bounty. Somewhere beyond the heat haze, riders were moving toward burnt corn. Elias dismounted in front of the only standing tavern. The boardwalk complained beneath his boots. He pushed through the door, and every face inside turned toward him. Inside, stale tobacco and unwashed bodies fouled the air. A single oil lamp burned at the far end of the room, leaving the corners in darkness. Behind the bar stood a woman who looked as though she had been forged in the same fire as the land itself. Elena Vance was 37 years old, but her eyes held the exhaustion of a century. Her hair was the color of wheat after a long, devastating dry spell, pale, brittle, and beautiful in a tragic sort of way. Her eyes were a sharp, piercing blue that seemed to strip away the grime on Elias's coat to see the rot underneath. She was a widow, a title she wore like a shroud in a territory that chewed up the lonely and spat out their bones. The frontier had claimed her husband 2 winters ago, taken by a fever that didn't care about a man's strength or a woman's prayers. No, she was a solitary fortress in a land of predators. Elias walked to the bar, his spurs jingling a rhythmic, metallic warning. He didn't speak. Words were a currency he had long ago spent, to the point of bankruptcy. He placed a single silver coin on the scarred wood, the metal ringing true in the silent room. Elena looked at the coin, then shifted her gaze to the man behind it. She saw the pair of flintlock pistols tucked into his belt, their grips worn smooth by years of use. She saw the way his fingers twitched near the leather, a subconscious reflex of a man who lived by the second eld. "You're far from home, stranger," she said, her voice like dry silk brushing against stone. "I don't have a home," Elias replied, his voice a mixture of gravel and wood smoke. "Then you're in the right place," she said. "Nobody in burnt corn has a home anymore. We just have places where we haven't died yet." She poured him a glass of rye from a bottle with no label. The liquid was cloudy, smelling of turpentine and the desperate need to forget. Elias took a sip, winced as it burned a path down his throat, and felt the first spark of warmth in his chest. Elena did not pour herself a drink. She kept glancing toward the window, expecting someone, Elias asked. "Hoping not to see them," she said. Somewhere beyond the town, a horse gave a distant cry. Suddenly, the heavy, Rhythmic thud of multiple hooves echoed from the dusty street outside. The tavern went deathly silent. The few drunks in the corners, suddenly sober and rigid. Elena's face went pale, the blood draining from her lips until they were a thin, white line of terror. "They're here," she whispered, the words barely catching on the stagnant air. "Who?" Elias asked, his hand instinctively drifting toward the pistol at his belt. "The jackals," she said, her voice trembling. "They burned 2 farms north of here last week," Elena said. "Killed every man who tried to stop them. Miller leaves 1 survivor alive, so the story travels ahead of him. They want this land, but more than that, they want the well behind this house. It's the only dependable water for miles. The fighting drove families from their farms, and the summer nearly dried the creek bed." Elena looked toward the back wall, where a faded coat still hung from a wooden peg. "My husband dug that well," she said. "He died, believing this place could survive. I won't hand it to Miller because 4 men carry guns. 3 families still draw from it," she continued. "If Miller takes the well, they either serve him or leave their homes behind." She looked at Elias, her hands shaking so violently she had to grip the edge of the bar. She reached across the wood and grabbed his forearm, her grip desperate and surprisingly strong. "Please," she breathed, her eyes searching his for a spark of humanity he wasn't sure he still possessed. "I'm just a traveler, lady," Elias said, trying to pull away from the weight of her plea. "They'll kill me if they find me alone, and then they'll take everything I have left," she said. She leaned in closer, the scent of peppermint and raw fear hitting him like a physical blow. "Pretend you're my husband," she begged, the words tumbling out in a rush. Elias froze, the absurdity of the request momentarily overriding his survival instinct. "What?" he asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Just until they leave," she said. "Tell them you came home from the war. Tell them you're the man who owns this tavern and everything attached to it. If they think I'm a widow, they'll just take what they want and leave my body in the dust. But if they think I have a husband like you..." She paused, looking at his guns again. "Maybe they'll think twice. Maybe they'll see a cost they aren't willing to pay." Elias looked toward the rear door. 10 steps, perhaps less. He could be gone before the riders dismounted. Running was what had kept him alive. It was also the only thing he had ever been good at. Then, he noticed the faded coat on the peg, and Elena's hand trembling against the bar. For one bitter instant, he remembered another doorway, another frightened face, and the night he had chosen himself. Elias felt the immense weight of her stare, a pressure more suffocating than the Alabama heat. He had abandoned better people for smaller reasons. He still remembered every face, but in that moment, he saw a woman standing on the very edge of a crumbling cliff. Elias covered Elena's trembling hand with his own. "Don't contradict me," he said. The tavern doors burst open with a violence that sent a cloud of dust swirling into the room. The afternoon sunlight flooded in, blindingly bright, like a physical blow to the senses. 4 men stepped into the shadows, dressed in buckskins, filth, and the arrogance of the lawless. The leader was a man named Miller, a name whispered in taprooms with a shudder. He had a jagged, puckered scar across his throat that looked like a second mouth refusing to close. He carried a long rifle across his chest as though it were part of him. He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the drunks before settling on the bar. "Well now," Miller rasped through the scar. "The widow has finally found herself some company to pass the lonely hours." Elena didn't hesitate. She stepped out from behind the bar and walked straight to Elias. She wrapped her arm through her body leaning against his shoulder as if he were an anchor in a storm. "He's my husband," she declared. "He's Elias Vance. He's been away with Jackson's army. He fought at Horseshoe Bend. He just got home this morning, and he's in no mood for visitors." Miller paused, his eyes narrowing as he squinted at the tall, dusty man in the shadows. "Is that right?" Miller asked, stepping closer until the smell of horse sweat and rot preceded him. "I've been through here every week for a month, and I never heard a whisper about no husband." Elias didn't move a muscle. His body as still as a predator waiting in the tall grass. He could feel Elena trembling against his side, a secret vibration of terror that only he could detect. "I don't like people talking about my business," Elias said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. His hand rested near the grip of one pistol, casual enough to look harmless. "I was at Horseshoe Bend," Elias said. "I saw enough killing there to last 3 lifetimes. Now I'm home, and I find a man standing in my house with a muddy pair of boots and a loud mouth." Miller laughed, a short, ugly sound that lacked any hint of genuine mirth. "Horseshoe Bend was months ago." "Soldier," Miller countered. "Where have you been since then?" Miller asked. "Why did it take you so long to find your way back to your pretty wife? That is none of your damn concern," Elias replied, his eyes locking onto Miller's with a cold intensity. "You have exactly 3 seconds to turn around and walk back through those doors." Miller looked at his men, who were already fanning out with practiced, lethal efficiency. "I don't think you're a husband," Miller said, his thumb dancing over the hammer of his rifle. "I think you're a drifter who wandered into the wrong tavern at the wrong time. I think you're a liar, and I think Elena here is just trying to save her skin with a fairy tale." He started to raise the rifle, its barrel leveling toward Elias's chest. The hammer of the rifle clicked back, a sound that felt as loud as a thunderclap in the confined space. Elias didn't draw. He waited for the precise moment when the choice would become final. "You want the water?" Miller Elias asked, his voice strangely calm. Miller nodded, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "We want the water. We want the tavern. And maybe we want the widow for a night or two." Elias felt Elena's grip tighten on his arm, her fingernails digging through his sleeve and into his skin. Leaving her now would make him the same man he had spent years trying not to remember. Elias smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was a cold, terrifying expression of predatory intent. "Then you're going to have to kill me first," Elias said. "And Miller, you won't be the first man who tried." Miller snarled, his face contorting with rage as he brought the rifle to his shoulder. Miller's rifle rose. Elias drew. His first pistol fired before Miller could steady the rifle. The shot threw Miller backward, and his weapon discharged into the ceiling as he struck the floorboards. Elias dropped the empty pistol and drew the second. The man by the window reached inside his coat. Elias fired, sending him crashing across a table as bottles shattered beneath him. The gunman at the rear door fired. The shot tore through Elias's sleeve, grazing his upper arm before burying itself in the wall behind the bar. A bottle rolled from the shelf beside Elena. She seized it and hurled it into the gunman's face, spoiling his second shot. "Under the bar," she shouted. Elias dropped behind an overturned table. His hand found a loaded musket beneath the counter, the weapon Elena's husband had left behind. He raised it through the smoke and fired. The rear gunman fell against the door. The last jackal stared at the 3 bodies, dropped his weapon, and fled into the street. Seconds later, the pounding of his horse faded into the heat. The gunfire stopped. For several seconds, no one in the tavern moved. Elias rose through the smoke, one hand pressed to his wounded arm. Elena was huddled behind the bar, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awe. She was gasping for air, her chest heaving as if she had just run 100 miles. Elias lowered the musket. Though his ears still rang from the gunfire, he didn't look at the bodies. He had learned long ago that the dead have nothing to say to the living. He looked at her, his expression unreadable behind the mask of dust and smoke. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice returning to its usual gravelly tone. She shook her head, her movements jerky and uncertain. She stood up on shaky legs, leaning on the bar for support. As she surveyed the carnage, she looked at the man who had just ended 3 lives to keep a lie alive for her. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elena came around the bar and tore a strip from her apron. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine. You're bleeding on my floor." She bound his arm before looking up at him. "You've been watching that back door since you arrived," she said. "A man doesn't look at an exit that often, unless he's spent his whole life leaving." Elias looked toward the doorway, now empty except for drifting smoke. "Why did you stay?" she asked. "Because you asked me to," he said. He paused, then added, "And because I was tired of running." Before sunset, they buried the dead beneath the pines. Together they buried the dead beneath the pines. He didn't wince this time. The burn of the alcohol was nothing compared to the fire in his soul. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon outside, casting long, distorted shadows across the town. The southern frontier was still a dangerous, unforgiving place, filled with men like Miller. By nightfall, Elias told himself he would leave as soon as his arm stopped bleeding. 3 days later, he saddled his mare before dawn. Elena stood on the porch, but did not ask him to stay. "The man who escaped may come back with others." Elias said, "I know." He looked at the damaged roof, the well behind the tavern, and the faded coat still hanging inside. Then he loosened the saddle and carried his bedroll back through the door. "I'll stay until the roof is fixed," he said. The roof took a week. The fence took another. Elias patched the roof before the rains came, repaired the fence, and guarded the well on moonless nights. The law never came for him in burnt corn, perhaps because the territory was too busy eating itself. Or perhaps they were simply too afraid of the man who lived in the tavern with the blue-eyed widow. 1 year after Miller's death, a traveling preacher passed through burnt corn. Elena asked whether Elias still meant to leave. "Not today," he said. They were married beside the well before sunset. They lived together for 20 years. A lifetime in the brutal chronology of the frontier. They never had children of their own, but they shared a bond that went deeper than blood. When the Creek War was finally a distant, painful memory, the locals would still tell the story. They told the legend of the widow and the gunman who appeared out of a heat haze. They talked about the day the deadliest gang in the territory rode in looking for water. And they talked about the day those men never rode out. Elena Vance died peacefully in her sleep when she was 57 years old. Elias was sitting by her side, his hand holding hers until the last of the warmth faded away. He buried her on the hill, overlooking the tavern, where she could watch the sun set over the dust.
He didn't leave the town after the funeral. He had nowhere else to go and no one else to be. He sat on the porch in the evenings, an old man whose hands didn't twitch anymore. The Remingtons were still clean, oiled and ready, tucked away in a trunk at the foot of his bed. He looked at the empty chair beside him and thought about that first day in the tavern. He thought about the words she had begged him to say, the lie that had saved her life. In the quiet of the evening, he realized she hadn't been asking him to play a part. She had been offering him a destiny, a chance to be the man he had forgotten he could be. For years, Elias had believed a man was nothing more than the worst thing he had done. Elena had taught him otherwise. The first time she called him her husband, it had been a lie meant to save her life. By the time he buried her, it was the truest name he had ever carried. He remained in burnt corn until the end of his days, sitting each evening beside her empty chair as the sun disappeared behind the pines. Travelers still told stories about the outlaw who rode into town looking for water and found a reason to stop running. Most of the details changed with every telling. One did not. Elias Thorne chose to stay. Historical note: Burnt Corn and Horseshoe Bend were real events of the Creek War. In 1814, this region was still part of the Mississippi Territory. Alabama Territory would not be established until 1817. Elias, Elena, Miller, and the Red Jackals are fictional characters created for this story.